for our Boulder Design by Design initiative, which we're calling Spartan Core. So I've invited 3 experts in various aspects of experiential learning to just have a discussion with us and just have a dialogue. Yeah, sorry. When we first set this up, I was picturing, like club chairs or something like that, deep leather club chairs, but sorry, this is the best we could do. And Frank even agreed to make a rare appearance after retirement, back to the campus. So thank you. So let's start with some introductions. John, would you introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Dirks. I'm professor of higher adult and lifelong education in the College of Education. I'm also the director of the College of Education's MA online program, so I have a partial administrative hat. And one of the things that I'm doing, we'll hear more about that, I think, is I'm co-lead on what we call Megatrend 3 of the Global Center for Food Systems Innovation that Chris has mentioned a little bit ago, and some really exciting things are going on there. Do some other things as well, but that's basically who I am.
I'm Phil Gardner. I'm the director of the Collegiate Employment Research Institute and currently serving as executive director of Career Services.
And a devotee of the T-shaped scholar professional.
Hi everybody, I'm Frank Fear and came to Michigan State in 1978, and left in 2013 and came back. This is the first time I've been out of my house. These lights are awfully bright. I'm just having a very difficult time with these, but I was a faculty member for all those years and retired as Senior Associate Dean at Ag and Natural Resources.
Thanks, you can keep that one. Well, so why are we having this conversation? Well, this is from my perspective. So having spent over 20 years helping create distance and online learning, using technology in service of courses and programs and learning outcomes from that perspective, I'm a little disappointed that the definition of quality for online has not really risen as high as it could. In most circumstances, it's a little mediocre, kind of using classroom-based instruction as the golden measure has been very successful. The 10 years of annual surveys by the Sloan Foundation show that something like, I think 70 or maybe close to 80% now of chief academic officers in their survey across the whole country now agree that online learning is as good as or better than on campus. Great. All right, now what do we do, right? So there are a few people focusing on, adaptive learning environments, personalized learning and gaming and things like that. But overall, I think because we left the last 10 years of higher education innovation to the for-profits, the definition of quality, in my opinion, has been kind of paltry, right? And the focus when I go to conferences on online learning, which is now all about automation, personalization, competencies. It's not the way we do it here at MSU. This is the way they do it at other places, not just for-profits, but other locations. And the big spending and investments that the Gates Foundation is making in competency and personalized learning, it's clearly that is where things are going. I love that. I don't really have anything against it, but when you look at a place like MSU, where we have all these other values, all these other outcomes, all these other stakeholders for economic development, engagement of different forms, we're embedded in communities around the world, we do worldwide research. It just doesn't come across in the course catalog and the course. I did a blog post a little while ago that, just for fun, with the WCET Frontiers blog that I called How the Course Catalog Killed Education, because I think the problem isn't technology that's commoditized it, it's the credit hour and our focus on the course and course outcomes and rolling all that up into a very kind of a mechanized view of what a degree is. I think that's, it's not a great trend, and it defines quality in a very, very limited way. That's easy to achieve using technology, but it leaves out all this other stuff. So in looking at it, I'm thinking that things we call under, as a general umbrella, experiential learning, is where the value is. That's where our real return on the time and investment is. So anyway, this is part of my exploration to ask you guys questions about what your thoughts are. So let's start with, well, what do we mean by experiential learning? Frank, you want to start?
John, what's your thinking about that question? Yeah, so I think it's time for a break. Using today's terms, it's really engagement. The term that is used in High Shop is the pinnacle in terms of a focus of it at the university. But engaging students in activities, involvements, that typically involve some form of service to society, but also can be associated with getting a better handle on the kinds of professional roles they're going to be playing, whatever their field or discipline might be.
That's the talking stick.
Yeah, that is a talking stick. Well, it's a little bit more than that. It's because from my end, looking back, these are building blocks. You have to have social learning. You have to understand context, because when you get out in the real world, it moves very fast, very quickly, it becomes chaotic, and unless you have experiences outside the classroom that challenge you to think, you're learning in different ways. It challenges you to work with others that don't always agree that the way you learn or what you've learned is the same. You have to negotiate skills and values and behaviors to move an organization ahead, and you don't get that by just sitting in a classroom. So, the MOOC things are great if you want a particular skill, like the big MOOCs out of Stanford are all on big data. Well, there's a lot of companies that want just somebody to do big data, but that's all you're going to do in that company. You're probably not going to go anywhere else unless you have these broader sets of skills that only come through social interaction and social learning. And these kind of experiential opportunities, and though we've kind of distorted some of them, are the building blocks. They're the Lego blocks that you have to have. The question is how you put the Lego blocks together.
John?
In a prior life, I was a clinical microbiologist, and so I have a really strong orientation to experience-based, experiential learning. A good part of my background, and when I was teaching clinical microbiology, was through experiential activities, and so I have this really strong affinity towards experiential learning, but I also have a very deep interest and commitment to theory. And so for a long time, I think I've always been interested in the tension between learning through activities and learning through and about theory. It seems to me that, in a very simple way, experiential learning is simply the learning from and through experience. But there's all sorts of ways in which that happens in our lives. We learn to take different routes to and from work if we're dissatisfied with what it is that we're doing. We learn to eat in different places. We learn to eat different foods and so forth and so on. So there's all sorts of ways in which we engage in learning in a kind of lifelong way. I think the question that we're dealing with here is the kind of the ways in which we connect experiential learning with the subject, with theory, with content. And so I think that's part of the difficulty that I think faces experiential learning, is to understand the ways in which we can arrange activities for students that augment, that complement their sort of academic subject matter focus, but also help them deepen their understanding in a very sort of meaningful way, what that means for them. So I think that's the part that I would add to this, is that for me, within an academic context, experiential learning is in a sense all about learning the subject. But it depends upon how you define what the subject is. I think that's sort of the key.
Yeah, maybe that's a good segue for Phil to talk about the T-shape. What is that?
What? Yeah, I know. The T-shape. Well, the T-shape is the, given the changes in the way we do work and the pressures about education being more ROI, return on investment. Really what we're seeing on the other side is a different kind of person. And this plays very well into higher education, plays well into the liberal arts. That's why I like it. But it's somebody that's deep in a disciplinary knowledge, that has cross-disciplinary abilities to talk and understand other disciplines. So that when you're in a system and working on a problem in a system with multiple colleagues from different disciplines, you can understand them. So a biologist can talk to an economist, or you can talk to somebody in IT if you're a biologist or whatever. But the most important thing is you have to learn some boundary spanning skills that transcend the discipline, that takes your disciplinary knowledge and spreads it wider. And these are the cross-cultural skills, teamwork skills, higher order communication skills, actually critical thinking skills, because critical thinking usually generates and comes from thinking across disciplines. And they put it together and it looks like a T. And for IBM, which I work with IBM on this, IBM has a system in there. We translate that into what President Simon calls the grand challenge, or the great challenges for the 21st century. They almost map to the same thing. So if you're interested in the food system, we talked about the food system, a student needs to understand what the food system is, from sustainable ag all the way up to high production ag, and all the components that go in it, so they can navigate the system as they begin to solve bottlenecks and problems in the system. And then the most important thing for a T is the me part. And this is why it takes a whole campus to do that, because an I, which is somebody just deep in knowledge, really gains recognition and who they are by their externals, how well they push their, deep they go in their research, how sophisticated their research methods become, and their analytical techniques and the models they build. But a T has to know more about themselves and who they are, what they value, who they are, what the direction they're going into, because you have to transcend all these boundaries. And so now here you come back to service learning and things like that. That's where more than skill development, value affirmation takes place among a lot of students. They really figure out what they value, reaffirm what they value. They learn to see things in different ways that begin to build the me part that has to hold this all together.
Wow, great explanation. You guys have any comments on that, on the T-shape? The T-shape
Frank,
professional?
you just
T-shape scholar?
retired way early. We're going to get real exciting around here.
I'm working on the R shape. I'm just reminded of T-shirt all the time.
So Frank, one of the innovations that I think you helped create, I don't know how long ago it was, is the Bailey Scholars Program. And how long ago did you create that? And can you talk about that? Because I think that's an early initiative, and I had some people come here on campus and said, you know, you got a great innovation right in your own backyard.
You have to do that. Let me stand up, because what I want to do is use a prop here. When Chris invited me to speak, one of the things I did, as academics do, was to go to my library with a specific purpose of looking at the history of Michigan State University with respect to experiential learning. I strongly recommend this book in that regard. It's called Service Learning: Of Movement's Pioneers Reflect on Its Origin, Practice, and Future. And it's co-edited, co-written actually. Timothy Stanton is the lead author. And one of the things that you learn by reading that is how many of the things that we just talked about are connected to people and events and circumstances that occurred at Michigan State going way back to the 1960s. How many of you know the name John Dooley? Okay, good. How many of you know the name Mary Edens? Very good. Don't raise your hand anymore. Yeah, exactly. Okay, how old are you? Okay. Judy Sorum Brown, Jane Smith, John DiBiagio, Mary Lee Davis. Okay, and I'm getting more in time. Okay, John Dooley, and we talk about Bailey. John Dooley was one of those persons who sought me out as a young assistant professor back in 1978. Another name from the past, really a title. Lyman Briggs, we know that, right? James Madison College, we know, right? How many of you know Justin Morrill College? You do, certainly Kent does. One of the things that I think explains the Bailey program, or describes or sets a platform, is exactly what occurred at Michigan State and has been repeated over the years, over the decades, and that is you find this sweet spot that is between administrative leadership and vision, at least an administrative agenda at the very least, and faculty inspiration, interest, etc. And almost always on the faculty side, it's not one person, it's a group of people who work with the administration. Administration works with the faculty to bring new ideas forward. And John Dooley was the person who sought me out. In this book, John Dooley, who's in his 90s now, we still communicate, he's a community activist, is identified as the godfather of the experiential education movement in the United States. What started as an office of volunteer programs at Michigan State years ago, back in the 60s, I think, evolved into the Service Learning Center. Story, I don't want to go too long, but a story, I think. I came here in 78, 79, John invited me to a conference held here. May have been in this room. And Provost Clarence Winder was the provost at the time. And of course, as provosts do, I've done this myself, you introduce a group of people and say, welcome to Michigan State. Well, he just didn't say, welcome to Michigan State. What he said was, if you want this field to grow, you must be academically grounded, it must be connected to theory, and you must be able to demonstrate impact. I understand there are a number of people here who are of the field, who are greatly enthusiastic about the field, but always remember you're at a university. So focus on scholarship and impact. And there was a lot of grumbling. How could a provost, and there were people from all over the country, how could a provost welcome us and basically, as some interpreted, diss us at the same time? Well, what Dr. Winder was saying really was very important, and John Dooley took that to heart. And what he did through the late 60s and early 70s was work on the assessment of experiential learning. And he was one of the founders of the Council for Assessment of Experiential Learning, CALE. And they actually brought the conference here one year. And, you know, as I evolved over the years, it was really critical, the learning back then, of connecting theory, ideas, to new ideas, and using the new ideas as really, and the entities that evolved as a learning laboratory. So when we were invited by Dr. Poston, and the reason I give this background is that even though Bailey is innovative, in some ways unique, it fits the culture, it fits the context. There are a lot of programs like that, and the pattern is pretty much the same. Then Dean Fred Poston, now Dean Fred Poston, when between was vice president, basically came to a group of the faculty and said, I'm worried that our students are being trained too narrowly, that, you know, we're forming them in a very narrow way, animal science, whatever it might be in the college. We need something more, but I have no idea what it is. And he assembled a group of faculty to be able to deal with this whatever. Jim Lucas was, as a graduate student, was involved in the beginning of that. Jim and I first met when he was a student involved in AmeriCorps, when my wife Kathy and I had a collaborative program between Albion College and Michigan State. So essentially we were tasked with putting together something that would cut across the college, now the university, that would essentially, interesting, we hadn't talked, address some of the very issues that John and Phil were talking about. But true to what is here, there's something we haven't talked about as explicitly as we need to, and that is the moral, ethical, and human development. It's not just civic mindedness, it's students finding a place in the world where they can be who they are and make a contribution to the world. And that from that, with those ideas, we developed a series of ideas. And I'm going to stop with this. One of the things that's really important, I think, about the Bailey program, we borrowed from a fellow by the name of D. Hock, H-O-C-K, first name D-E-E, and he's very important to every one of you, even though you may have never heard the name, because D. Hock was the chair of the design team that created Visa International, your credit card. Okay, yeah, yes, and he came up with the idea based on, because they had a hell of a problem with designing something that would work with unsecured credit. And what he realized, to make it work, you had to create, as Chris just said, if you heard her, a combination of connecting chaos with order. And he called it chaotic. D. Hock. And his first book is The Birth of the Chaotic Age. And so one of the most distinctive thing of the Bailey program is there are courses, there's a program, but there's no structure. Every single thing that occurs in that program is an emergent property of people sitting around the table and figuring out what they're going to learn. So if you go into a course, Kent's convened a course, you sit there, faculty and students together, co-learners, with a blank syllabus. And you decide together what you're going to learn, how you're going to learn it, when you're going to learn it, and very importantly, how are you going to assess it. And I'll stop with this. One of the persons I invited to the table at the beginning of that program was John Dewey. Because in some ways, the ideas in Justin Morrill College, which no longer exists, it ended in 1979, you find infused in the Bailey program. But the connection between faculty interest, but also administrative championship, wanting to make it happen. If it had just been administrators, or just been faculty, I don't think we would have the program. And it's been in existence now for 15 years or so.
I think it's interesting that you pulled from essentially corporate, right? Visa, right? I mean, a unique way of organizing, but there's that corporate link. And I think that's where, Phil, where you're focusing on the T-shaped scholar came from IDEO and then was adopted by IBM. And Phil's been working for a long time, a number of years, with IBM, developing that model and trying to generate empirical evidence to describe what it is. And it's something that was used just recently for those of you that were in the classroom, what was it called, the Smith & Associates classroom redesign, using this kind of model. What does it mean for instructional spaces? I think it creates an interesting dialogue, but that corporate connection, it doesn't exclude the corporate connection, it's synergistic with it. And Phil, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, the corporate connection.
Well, you know, at my end of the world, when I transitioned to students,
Mike.
No mic. Okay, my end of the world, with people here from my group, we worry about students transitioning out, so we interface with companies all the time. But what's unique about IBM is they found that while they're deep in scholars and they're deep in engineers, 35% of their workforce is from social science, humanities, and others because they can't solve problems in systems without them. And so what happens is when they found and brought those people together, unless they could talk to each other, unless they could communicate their ideas to each other, they couldn't solve problems. And so what they found out was that they needed even their deepest engineers and scientists that were developing neurochips and all that, had to be able to talk to social scientists, and social scientists had to be able to talk to technical people. And then they became quickly built on this idea that when you have these transformative smart machine technologies that can translate information everywhere so much faster than humans, that the humans have to do something different. And so what they've done is they've seen this T-shaped person as the ideal way. Well, basically, when Frank's talks and when we go back to RD and all those days when we were together, you know, that's basically what we're teaching the person to be. It would be you're deep in a discipline, but you can talk to other people and have these skills. And I mean, I'm about as far away from RD today as I could get, but I probably use it every single day, and because that's what the structure of that was. And so it's just, what's interesting is we're all hung up on STEM right now. I don't want to offend anybody in the STEMs, but actually, if you listen to the IBM people, they're talking about STEAM. They put the arts and humanities back in it. They know that we're going down a bad path if we continue to undermine and limit the potential of the arts and humanities, which seems to be in the press these days. And so the T is a way to advocate for a broader set of disciplinary knowledge, as long as the students understand that these building blocks they have and can articulate them to an employer, they can start. It's when they aren't able to do that, and these Lego blocks are just laying around in little stacks that they have done that event and then they go to the next event. It's the part that's a challenge for us on the stage and everybody in this room is how we help students put those Lego blocks together so they can launch off into whatever they want to do when they graduate. That gives them their purpose, that gives them their motivation. They can see their potential because we begin to draw from each of these experiences what the common core things that they develop.
So we have some interesting a framework, the T-shaped framework, to pull some of this together. We have a really rich history that I wasn't aware of, so thank you, Frank, for sharing all of that. And you said CALE, one of the founders of CALE was from here. All right, so they're one of the engines for prior learning assessment, right, that's helping create this new generation learning system of competency-based and personalized learning. They're a key part of that whole ecosystem. So we have a lot to build on here. John, can you share your perspective? And how does this link to the work that you're doing, the Center for Global Food Systems Innovation? The Megatrend 3, as they call it, is your area with Tom Smith, and the translational scholars are integrated in with that work. And it seems to me what Frank's sharing about the Bailey idea and experiential learning and our history here and our roots, and what Phil's sharing with the T-shape, you're bringing to life in many ways in that Megatrend 3.
I love that Megatrend 3 title. It always reminds me of the Michelin Man, you know, it's like, kind of like that metaphor.
If you want to say what it is, what Megatrend 3 is.
Yeah, the Global Center for Food Systems Innovation is actually comprised of what we call three megatrends, and four, depending upon how you count cross-cutting units. The first two megatrends are basically focusing on the issues that are associated with the food system relative to things like changing the global warming and urbanization, transformation of the food system, those sorts of things. And what Megatrend 3 is focusing on are the implications of those trends in the sciences and the innovations that are being developed around those trends for the development of food systems workers for the future. So basically our task is to look at the nature of the skills that are going to be required by these emerging kinds of areas within the food system globally, and then to envision and to perhaps facilitate the innovation of ways to address those. So in many respects, it's really looking at the sort of the cutting edge and transformation of higher education in some regards, but not just higher education, but also vocational and technical education, informal forms of learning within the food system, and that sort of thing. So it's a very dynamic and fluid process, and at the core of all of this, of course, is learning from and through experience, both us as researchers, but also helping the practitioners. So instead, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, if you look at the traditional role of extension workers, which was to go to the farmers, deliver information, update them on information, and then go back home, go back to their office, or go on to the next farm. And that extension model has been shared internationally, and so is in practice in a lot of areas of the world as well. We're trying to, through the Global Center, as well as through many other areas, we're trying to sort of help transform that approach to education so that we make use of things like farmer field schools, for example, where farmers are actively involved in the identification of the problems that they want to address and looking at the ways in which they might go about investigating those problems and coming to some kind of definition and decision with respect to the actions that they want to take to address their problem. It's a wonderful model on a small scale of what we're talking about throughout the center. The difficulty that I have with much of this, however, is with the traditions of higher education. And so what we're facing in the Global Center for Food Systems Innovation, for example, we've just completed our first round of work in East Africa. And what we're finding is that this is an Anglophone kind of area, right? They have inherited a good deal of the British form of higher education. And they are carrying with that sort of like their conceptions of knowledge. And their conceptions of knowledge are not consistent with the kind of conception of knowledge that we're talking about in experiential learning. They're quite different. And so when you talk about all of these things with faculty in Tanzania or Kenya or wherever, you're talking to people who have one sort of way of thinking about what they're about and holding fast to that, while at the same time trying to get them to adopt and adapt more experiential learning activities. You know, I think that's true to some degree in the U.S. as well. It's not just the developing countries that have this issue. I think faculty as a whole have a one way of thinking about what it is that they're about as teachers, as faculty members, and they have a certain conception of knowledge that's parallel or that aligns with that idea. And that idea is oftentimes not grounded in learning from and through experience. It's grounded in the subject matter. It's grounded in the mastery of the discipline. And so I think we're probably singing to the choir here, and what we need to be doing is trying to figure out how we can work with faculty who have these fairly traditional ways of thinking about teaching and learning and helping them develop ways of transforming those conceptions so that they're more in line with the dynamic and exciting kinds of processes that are associated with experiential learning. So, I mean, this is just sort of a hint at the kind of thing that we're bumping into with the Global Center. I think this is a huge task for us across the world, not just in East Africa, but probably Southeast Asia, which we're moving into next. We're probably going to be working in Cambodia for a while, and West Africa. I think these are all issues within those different countries. How do we begin to transform, literally transform institutions and partnerships? Because remember, higher education is embedded, as we've already indicated, in the economic and the social fabric of these societies. And so when you talk about transforming an institution of higher education and the ways in which people go about the business of higher education, you're also talking about transformation of other units within society. And that has to be a multi-sector kind of collaboration. It cannot be just working with a single unit. So I think there's a lot on our plate in terms of trying to use this idea of experiential learning to help transform, literally transform, whole units of sectors within these societies, including our own.
So there's somebody with us today who does a lot of thinking about this, and that's Hy Fitzgerald. Do you want to make a comment about, so how would we do the transformation? Give us some examples just in a couple of minutes.
Sure. Well, thanks. Spot on, everybody out there. By the way, John Dooley's close to the mid-90s. Just published a chapter in a book that was just published. It's called Going Public. Pretty amazing. Actually dedicated to him as well. Well, our outfit, you just captured what our outfit here at Michigan State has as its primary responsibility. And that's helping the 5,000 faculty become more familiar with university community engagement, where that champions all the values you just said, the T-learning, crossing boundaries. There's a conference coming up in a couple of weeks in Lubbock, Texas, and the title of the conference is Boundary Spanning, and it's the Engagement Scholarship Consortium. 28 universities now coming together to say that engagement scholarship is really the foundational change, the third revolution in higher education. So we're pushing hard on that. The conversation you're having now fits perfectly with our agenda. The Global, telling you a little earlier, the Global University Network for Innovation out of Barcelona, which is part of the a university there, has a big long title, and the United Nations University and UNESCO's Committee on Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility of Higher Education is 100% focused on both community-based research, but also service learning, experiential learning. There's a network of now my colleagues around the world who are doing this. I will give you all their names and their universities and locations, one of which is in Hong Kong, and a colleague in Malaysia. So these are folks who are discovering that the transformational changes that we have to make in world societies really require universities to rethink how they're connected to those societies and to merge the two sets of knowledge, indigenous knowledge in communities, along with our academic sorts of knowledges, and blend those together. So it's a hot topic right now worldwide.
Thank you, Hy. So here's my question for you. So we've got about 15 minutes left. MSU also has a lot of experience relative to our peers and around the world in using technology for teaching and learning. And as you heard from this morning, there's various ways that we've been working with faculty, and we're certainly not the only places doing this, but I think we've spearheaded some new models of how you can combine teaching, learning, and research. They don't have to be siloed. So things like using a MOOC to gather data as opposed to just making it for dissemination. So when John Spink in Food Fraud did his MOOC, he had about 1,000 people. He actually did an IRB-approved survey to those people. That's a survey population, all right? In what ways can you design a MOOC for the purpose of gathering data? Is Abby still here?
Hi.
Yeah, we're exploring the idea of using MOOCs with our partners internationally to explore and gather data around gender specifically. You know, part of the GCFSI has a great data dashboard of food system information around the world, and Brent even suggested, what if we had like the Food Safety Knowledge Network, which is all about training and competencies? What if that was on the data set? Then you could ask questions like, what's the competency in food safety in these areas? And now this data is not combined. We sort of artificially separate them. For gender's a cross-cutting theme. Many places have different gender reports, different gender issues. There's lots of data in open content repositories that relate to these things. They need to be part of the data dashboard. We're just not used to thinking like that. So those are examples of how we could bridge research and then what we typically know about competencies in teaching and learning. And a lot of it has to do with open knowledge innovations and techniques, which is part of what Greg's exploring with his new model. So I guess it's not totally formed in my mind. I have no answers. I'm just curious. We have not only this great history and embeddedness in our mission and vision as MSU, we also have this technology capacity as well, and a pretty deep experience with using these tools on the teaching learning side of the house. How can we leverage that deep expertise of our faculty and staff in service to, what are some ideas of how we can do that in service to what you're doing in the Megatrend 3, what you're doing with T-shaped scholars, and what you might do in your retirement, Frank? What are some ideas? Where could we start?
Well, I'm going to try to answer your question, but I'm going to also come in from left field, I think, to a certain extent, in the sense that if we take a few steps back, experiential education on its face is pretty much meaningless. It does not have uniform meaning. As we started here, each one of us looked at a different slice. And let me go back in history and then come back and answer your question, at least try to. When John Dooley was involved in the 1960s and others, and you look at the genesis of what evolved here, it was really about activism. It was fueled by the Vietnam War. It was fueled by the desire of people on this campus to basically take a stand and to work with local people to bring about change. My guess is that if we look at whatever qualifies as experiential education on the campus now, this is anecdotal, I don't have any data, that probably most of the activism in the way that Dooley and others were involved back in the 60s is done through student clubs like ECO. So the question would be, to what extent do we want to infuse, define, include in experiential learning value-based positions with respect to where the world is now and where it's going? And one of the challenges for a place like Michigan State is we don't have a shared value system where everybody agrees we ought to be doing this, that, or the other thing. So it becomes much more complex than if we were, say, at a sectarian institution. And that leads to a direct answer to your question. And that is, I don't know how many of you know the name John McKnight. John McKnight is a big name in community development. He just retired from Northwestern. And he came up with a concept with others of what's called asset-based community development. And that is, let's not focus on the local problems. Let's identify the assets and build the assets. His most recent work is what he calls the fourth sector. We all know the private, nonprofit, public sectors. And his argument is, we've seen what they can do, thank you very much. The fourth sector is citizens associations. And that is local people everywhere, not just in this country, but everywhere, self-organizing for the purpose of taking greater control of their own future. One of the challenges I think we face as a university is that we tend to identify institutions as partners. Other universities, governments, and entities in the private, public, and nonprofit sector. So the question would be, as we think about all this knowledge and technology that we have, why don't we look more from the perspective of what can this do to enhance the capacity of local people in their local settings to live a better life on their terms? It doesn't mean to exclude partnerships with other institutions, but it really is, it goes back to, again, the spirit of what we had in the 60s with the organizing, that, and I'm going to use a word here that sometimes is used appropriately, I think, and sometimes not, development. Grassroots development. If there's anything, now that I'm away from Michigan State, I would like to see more of, is that Michigan State becomes does more work along the lines I've just described now. In fact, I think over the years, maybe it's not doing as much, but I think certainly the potential is there.
I almost want to punt on those questions, but the T-shaped, yes, right. Yeah, the T-shaped is still a metaphor, okay? And pieces of it we've worked on, and pieces of it we haven't even addressed yet. So I'm really not sure how that's going to evolve. I think the Space and Utilization Teaching in Space conference last week was a start to begin to build the dialogues to see how we're going to actuate that, and then we'll see how technologies. On the other hand, when I guess experiential education and the preparation on the end of the spectrum that I work with and my staff works with, in some ways we're pretty proactive with technologies, and we're trying some new things with technology, especially Garth. He may live to regret it, but he is going to try. But as a whole, we have not done a very good job with technology. And we're still kind of the concept that it's face-to-face individual, and we haven't used technologies to form these grassroots student groups. Because we really have to, what's going to drive this is students finding their purpose here. It's going to improve retention, it's going to improve time to graduation, it's going to improve, I'm convinced of that, into the transition. So it's a deficit for us on our ability to use technology on several things. And I think it's just beginning to figure out how to do that as we shift our mindset away from having to deal everything with an individual face-to-face to different ways to do it. And so that'll stretch it. I do want to say, though, that the University of South New Hampshire, I think it's Southern New Hampshire, which is all remote, the interesting thing that they do is they bring everybody back to campus to do all the experiential piece. The classes are all taught through MOOCs and online, but the residential experience is all experiential based.
So my initial response to that is that the kinds of things that I'm thinking about and the ways in which I'm thinking about Chris's question is that the technology is in potential and is not in actualization. And let me just explain for a minute what I mean by that. One of the major areas of interest for me has been for a long time is the idea of transformative learning. Transformative learning both at the level of the individual and of groups and organizations. And one of the things that's absolutely key to the understanding the idea of transformative learning is this fundamental shift in frame of reference. We begin to think about X in fundamentally different ways than we did before. And so that shift from the way we thought about something before to the way in which we're thinking about it now is a dramatic, profound shift, both for individuals as well as for organizations and societies, for that matter. And so, but what's involved in that is not just giving people information. It's not just bringing people together to talk about that information. What's involved in that is some profound dynamics. When the more experiential you go, the more you're inviting the subjective into the process of learning, and the more you have an affect and emotionality entering into the process, right? And so I'm not sure that technology is very well equipped right now to help us facilitate and work through those kinds of emotional and affective dynamics that are absolutely key to the process of transformative learning. What we're finding out in Megatrend 3 is that one of the most important things that we can help people, countries and regions learn to do is to play together, right? So to have all these different sectors that Phil talked about to sort of come to the table and learn to work together collaboratively around a common basis, a common ground. But what is that common ground, and how do you get to that common ground? That's going to be a messy, emotional, drag down, fight. There's going to be lots and lots of stuff associated with that. I don't know that technology is poised to help us with that yet. It can bring us together. It can create the platform, right? But we have to figure out the ways in which technology might be able to be used to help mediate the working through of these emotional dynamics. And I would just agree with Frank that I think at the core of transformative learning is a vision of the ethic. In June, I was invited to a conference in Freiburg, Germany, called Transformative Learning Meets Bildung. At the time, I had no idea what Bildung is, and at some point, I'm not sure that I do yet.
I went to high school.
Did Billy? But it's a marvelous, as you begin to think about it, it's a centuries-old idea and a marvelous notion of a blend of the educated person, character development, self-formation, that sort of thing. But it's pretty heady, right? And it doesn't necessarily help us understand the shadow work that's necessary for true transformation. right? Sort of coming to grips with our own inner demons and how those inner demons come to play out in an interpersonal and a social manner, right? And that happens a lot in the kind of work that we're talking about. And so I think that the idea of the ethic, the inner ethic, is really quite a powerful notion and something that we cannot lose track of at all.
Well, thank you for your reflections on my question. My reflections on what you suggested point to, I mean, social media is great for bringing out people's inner demons, you know? Right? Who would disagree with that? But I don't think technology is the way technology has been used in teaching and learning is mostly to mediate so you can provide access and do different things in the teaching learning process. It kind of is in the middle between the people. And that leads to kind of like automation. And I don't think using technology in service to experiential learning is not, in my view, when I think about it, isn't an automating the process or doing experiential learning remotely at all. But I do think when you were talking about grassroots efforts, I looked at Greg because that's what he's really trying to do. He's trying to create citizen groups, citizen science. It doesn't exclude institutions and organizations, but the real power of it's going to be seen on the ground and how people are empowered through openness, open systems, open software, open data to really solve their own problems. And of course, there's a role for institutions like MSU in that whole ecosystem as well. And I think maybe that's a fruitful place for us to focus. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting when we think about it. Is that on? Good. Just to key off what you were saying, we think about experiential education, we think of the locus being the university. But anybody who's done community development knows that's exactly what citizens do. Most of the time, when citizens come to a problem, many times it's new to them. And so they have to learn through engaged learning what they need to know. And many of them basically have to speak before public bodies. They have to write technical documents. And that's experiential learning, the same thing that we would hope our students would go through here. So when you think about the link and the power of technology to aid and abet experiential learning from a community point of view, because those of us in the field of community development, we never put the university first. It always has to be the community first. It's community development. So there is an important role, and it's happening, is the work that Greg's doing. I think we just need more of it.
And the second observation from your comments, this is something I'm thinking about a lot, is in what ways can technology aid us in assessing experiential learning? It's complicated. In what ways can the use of social media and digital knowledge repositories and so on, like the kinds of things that translational scholars are doing, that creates kind of a digital trail of reflection, observation, new knowledge, social connections? In what ways can we use that in ways that haven't been leveraged as much as they perhaps could be to help us assess what's really going on in experiential learning? And with that, I'll ask you guys to comment on that assessment idea, because that's a piece of the Spartan core, which is what we're talking about next.
Yeah, I'll talk about that because that's my biggest problem. The work I do on looking at how students transition and the factors that influence outcomes and their abilities. And there's a professor at the University of Kassel in Germany that's done the same thing, and we're both at the conclusion we don't really know what fosters some of the things that we've so grandly talked about yet. I mean, how these service learning, and we know what's embedded in it, but how does it influence outcomes? I mean, the early assessment pieces, we don't do much anymore. I mean, we did them, and now we don't do them. So we really don't know. So assessment now becomes the key. Now the question in assessment comes, are we going to measure the right things? And that's where I'm really struggling with on several things. It also leads to the biggest problem. One other problem I have is redefining. I'm caught up in the big debate about employability is the only accountable measure now of a college graduate. Do they get employed in the first job and how high their salary is? And if your major doesn't come up in the top 10%, then we should eliminate all those majors from existence. But employability doesn't mean what it did when they founded the concept of employability. So how do you measure what a true Spartan is supposed to be? I mean, this is the question, and I get it all across the country. How do we measure? And I am finding in our work we have tremendous lag effects about depth of knowledge and mastery major. It doesn't even begin to come into play until somebody in the current workforce is in 5-7 years. So we're really measuring at a different point what we want to measure. And it all comes back to the same question you're having. If we're going to do these experiential engagements, what do we really want the outcomes to be? Because we don't want to, we're so caught up in the processes now of getting these students engaged in doing things, we're forgetting about the outcomes and how we measure those outcomes. So we're really back, unfortunately, Frank, we've forgotten all our lessons from the 60s, and we kind of have to start over again. That's my opinion. It may not be as bleak as that, but...
I had a really well-formed response, and now it's completely flipped from my mind, so growing older, I guess. No, there's the problem with assessment is that you have to sort of specify it ahead of time, right? And experiential learning, by definition, is experience through the here and now, and it's also to some degree a somewhat individualized kind of an experience. So you're trying to look at and create experiences for students that are meaningful to them, right? And what's meaningful to Sarah is not going to be necessarily meaningful to Sam, but all of that has to come under some kind of an outcome-oriented umbrella that you can, in a sense, measure. So, I think that's sort of the one response that I would have, is that I think the notion of outcomes is, in a sense, at one level, sort of antithetical to the very aims of experiential learning in that regard.
And I'm going to, since Frank came out of retirement for this event to be here with us today, I'm going to give Frank the last word to send us off into the future.
I think we're done. I think we've been done for a time. We tried our best. I would just close, and I think about John personally, and the role he's playing on the food project. And it reminds me again of going back to John Dooley. He took seriously what Provost Winder said back in 1979. And when he began to work with Cale on the assessment of experiential learning, one of the first persons he brought into Michigan State was David Cole and his theory. And so one of the things I think it's so exciting at a place like Michigan State, we obviously have to focus on the assessment piece. No question. Are we making an impact? Can we do this better? But we can also become over-programmatized. And there's an extremely important role for faculty to bring their theoretical frames of reference to the table so that we're both enhancing the practice of, but we're also deepening the scholarship in. And I think that's a special obligation for a place like Michigan State. If all we do is advance assessment per se, but do not at the same time advance the way of thinking, deepening our understanding of these complexities, we're missing a tremendous opportunity. We have a history of doing that at Michigan State, so it's not a matter of, okay, we're going to do this now, we haven't done it before. I think we have to be mindful for it. And that's a game, I hate to use it that way, that's a game faculty across fields can play. Here we have a foods project, and then we have a colleague from the College of Education being drawn upon to inform and influence a food project. He likes food, yeah. So I mean, the low boundaries here makes this all possible. Thank you.
The one thing that I think is really important to consider is that I think if we try to assess mastery of content through experiential learning, it's sort of a rabbit hole we're never going to get out of. I think what would be much more effective is looking at the so-called soft skills, in particular the process of learning to learn. And so if we can develop as teachers and as scholars what really is involved, what competencies are involved in the process of learning to learn, we can then develop assessment procedures to determine the extent to which our experiential learning activities are contributing to the development of those skills among our students. That's what I forgot.
Thanks. So in the talk show format, I'd like to thank Dr. John, Dr. Phil, and Dr. Frank for joining us today for a really useful dialogue. Thank you.
Chris, I wonder if anyone has questions for our esteemed panel, if there are folks that might have questions they'd like
Questions,
to...
comments? We've got microphones for you. Marty, got a question? She does.
Hold on, Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina Doctor. I am in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology, and I'm interested in creating an experiential learning course. And at this point, I look at the course and the content, And it's kind of like, I'm not really sure what is Spartan Corp and like how do I connect with you and create a course that's experiential.
Well, gee, now we get down to the service level. How do we support efforts into doing that?
That's Dr. Doctor.
Yeah, that's right, Dr. Doctor. Well, of course, we're going to address the Spartan Core Initiative in the next section, but maybe you have some advice for Christine. It's a noble goal. Any advice?
Well, one of the great things, again, about Michigan State is the low boundaries. And we have colleagues all the time who seek to do something that's not something they've been educated or trained in. But there are colleagues across campus that you can interact with to be able to collaborate, to bring whatever you have in mind. And that's what I would do. I would start making contacts with people who have done experiential education, but who may not be of your field, and also reaching out to people who are in your field. There are examples in osteopathic medicine, human medicine, for example, people who are doing service learning. Engaged study abroad is something that's really starting to take off at Michigan State. And so I think there are ways. Don't feel as though you're alone and you have to come up with the model. There are colleagues around campus to help.
Okay, thanks.
So, Don, any advice for Christine?
I mean, I think, Christina, one way to think about this is where do you want to be on this continuum of experiential learning? Because you could go the whole route with service learning and that kind of thing, or you could sort of back off from that and say, I want to create a project-based curriculum or a problem-based curriculum. I want my curriculum and the students to study real-world problems in real-world context and begin there. I think that's a little bit easier to do. You can do that with parts of the curriculum. You don't have to transform the whole curriculum. You can do parts of it, and you can sort of ease your way into a more encompassing experiential approach.
Thanks for asking that question, because we have to link the theoretical to the actual action. So thank you for that question. Yeah, talk to Hi and Pat right behind you. They have some solutions. One more question or a comment? All right. Rashad, you've got a question. The man behind the camera.
I'll be fair and step out in front of the camera. I just had a question. Currently, is there a place for kind of factoring what kinds of, for self-analysis in the experiential learning, where you kind of pull out what are your own perceptions and how that influences what you learn? And I don't know, it just seems to me that in really analyzing what you can pull from an experience, you also have to factor what you bring to the table in that experience.
So, I mean, I think in a way you seem to be talking about the importance of reflection, right? And so creating, as you engage in these kinds of experiential learning activities, to also build in reflective learning episodes. We call them in study abroad, we call them debriefings. But in some respects, build them in, they become a regular part of the process, of the pedagogy of the curriculum. And so that those are in there, and they're not just sort of like, what did you learn today kind of things, but they're connected to the subject. They are grounded in the subject, and it also involves what's going on with you. So it's not just understanding the content of what you learned and reporting out and talking about that, but it's talking about the affective and emotional dimensions associated with the experiences that you had.
It's a great question. I keep on going back to John Dooley, because he really the grandfather of all of this. But one of the things that John emphasized in the work he did back in the 60s and 70s is that the experiential learning should not be an event. It needs to be incorporated, it needs to be internalized, or with you for the rest of your life. So in the Bailey program, we took that very seriously. And we have a series of basic questions. Who am I? What do I value? How do I learn? What is my worldview? And how does my professional and personal life connect? And those aren't questions really that are undergraduate questions or even Bailey questions. They're lifelong questions. You keep on, there's not an answer. The question is really important to be, those questions are important to be repeated. So there are places on campus where that kind of reflection is incorporated, embedded in a pedagogy.
And I have a question. I'll stand over here so I can be like an audience member. Does all this apply to adults, alums? Like, would alums benefit as much from experiential learning? Or is this just an undergraduate, developmental kind of thing?
Well, one of the interesting, part of what I do is work, both I lead graduate study abroad groups, and I also study graduate study abroad groups. And one of the things that I've come into contact with that group is practitioners, people who are not students, are forming or in going a study abroad. And the kinds of activities that they engage in through that process is an example, I think, of Chris, what you're talking about, is that clearly what these things are lifelong, as Frank said, these are lifelong sorts of talents, of commitments, of skills, and we develop them throughout our entire lives. The context changes as we grow older, I think, and it's in part developmental, but I think without question, these are things that we carry well into adulthood and beyond, probably.
Well, that was very good. I mean, that's true. I mean, it's just the flippant answer is everybody needs it. I mean, the world that we work in and transgress this changes so much that your career's not on, it loops a loop. It's like one of those big roller coasters. So you've got to continually invest in additional experiences, see where you want, how you want to go, and if you want to go up into. So it has to become the norm, regular part of your life. I mean, and it will change over your lifespan depending on what you want to do. But I'm still going through it now, and I should be retired with Frank.
Yes, I'm on the board of the Fort Myers MSU Alumni Association, and I have had a chance to really work very closely with Spartan alums on the west coast of Florida, and there's a bunch of them. There is a particular group, students who graduated from Michigan State in the 60s and 70s and through about mid-80s. Those are folks who feel very strongly, as do the younger alums. But for the most part, they're moving along in their careers. Their kids have graduated from high school, maybe college, most of them, and they have a great feeling for Michigan State. For them to be involved experientially in service, and I'll put a pitch for this, development projects sponsored by Michigan State, both in this country and abroad, they will pay for doing it. They would pay for doing it. And they would talk about it for the rest of their lives, and they'll talk about it with their friends and colleagues and encourage them to do it. I view this as one of the most important next steps, frontiers, for if we're talking about expanding the Spartan nation, imperializing, Imperial MSU, taking over the world. Let's get our alums involved. Let's go down and replay that game at Notre Dame with alums. We'll win.
That's a perfect setup for our next session after the break, is a conversation all about just that, which is called Spartan Core. So please come back in about, Jerry, 10 minutes?
Yeah, so if you want to come back, say at 10:55, we'll reconvene.
All right, thank you, everybody.